So welcome everybody to the webinar, When Your Students Need Help, the Key Components of Tier 2 and Tier 3 Interventions. I'm so pleased to have Adam and Sephram join us for this webinar podcast. Let me first introduce Adam Bain. He's been a superintendent at the Holton Public Schools for over 7 years now. Adam holds a graduate degree in educational leadership from Michigan State University. Hey, go Spartans! And a doctorate in educational leadership from CMU, Central Michigan University. Having started his career as an 8th grade social studies teacher and later serving as a secondary principal, Adam has a deep understanding of the needs of kiddos and teachers alike. So his research focuses on student mental health and teachers training, and he is dedicated to fostering a positive educational environment through community partnerships. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
And Sephram Raymond is our Director of Instructional and Intervention Services at Holton Public Schools. Sephram plays a crucial role in overseeing the curriculum and assessment strategies within the school district. She's a champion of the multi-tier system of support MTSS program and also serves as the Title IX coordinator, ensuring compliance with education regulations and promoting a safe and respectful learning environment. Welcome, Sephram.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, let's just launch in and get into some real practical conversation. So Adam and Sephram, you can tag team the way you feel appropriate. And I just want to start with more of a reflective process. Talk us through your MTSS journey, where you started, and why did you adopt an MTSS framework and some of the building blocks that you focused on. If you could just walk us through that, that'll be great.
Sure. I think for me in my journey, especially as a building principal, it's really started to observe significant student needs that were far beyond instructional supports, that really were major struggles with mental health, emotional regulation, struggles that were barriers that were difficult for a school system to intervene and provide support around. And as we were trying to work to support students who were having some of these escalated needs, it was very challenging to have any sort of coordinated effort. And it often felt like we were kind of chasing our own tail, trying to connect students with some sort of support, whether that be, food assistance to a mental health intervention that a student needed. And because of this lack of coordination and the inability to really have ready and available resources for those sorts of needs, it really felt like we were letting kids fall through the cracks. And in the meantime, we're seeing academic struggle, we're seeing classroom environments that really aren't conducive to learning. And so there was a real driving desire and need for us to think about how we support students differently. As we were discussing and reviewing our data, the team really settled on we have to improve and we have to find ways to tighten our safety net so that kids are not falling through the cracks. And that really resulted in a real dialogue about how do we provide school-based services so that kids are more immediately connected to the help that they need. And so in the course of several years, we started building relationships and we started to really think about how we systematically support students as they demonstrate needs that may be outside the classroom. And that resulted in a lot of different layers to the work, but really drove what Sephram's position is, which is really coordinating all of those efforts and essentially looking at the student really as a whole student, and that there are these instructional side to a student and being able to get them to learn at really high levels. But then there's also everything else that makes the student who they are as a person. And that those two things together are what make a really strong multi-tiered system of support. And we call it the student safety net here. That safety net is really what we want to create to be as tightly woven as possible to catch all of those academic and non-academic needs that a student might exhibit, so that we're able to help them achieve at high levels.
That's so insightful. I think when I think about the role of a school and an education, it doesn't start and end with just academic needs, and there is so many of social determinants which impact, whether the kid shows up to the school or not, and what all affects the kiddo in their uh, being present in the class and the outcomes that they achieve. Could you double click on um, you mentioned it's a multi-year approach that you had taken, and you had talked about safety net. Define safety net more broadly for me. Like, what does it mean? Who all participate in the safety net? And then, as reflect on that, in the multi-year journey, could you kind of break it down a little bit in terms of what did you do first? Were there building blocks that you systematically used to get to where you are today?
Sure. I think I'll start with that second question first. So we really started with, and this was for me as a building leader, trying to systematically be able to support students, really from a data-driven standpoint as well, and not a wait for the student to exhibit, significant behavioral concerns, but really trying to catch and be thoughtful around those that may be internalizing some things that require
Mhm.
support. And so we embraced the ABCs and started looking at data just from using attendance, behavior, and course grades. And those three things turned into gargantuan spreadsheets where we were trying to analyze and, hand establish who is the greatest need, who's got data concerns in all three categories. They're absent, they have poor behavior, and their grades are struggling. And then we would talk about those kids. And it really turned into, there were monthly meetings and we would start directly after school. Sometimes even during the school day, we would get started, and some of those meetings lasted until 9 or 10 p.m. as we,
Hmm.
the need was so significant of trying to reach the students and build a plan that then we could follow up on in the next meeting to ensure that those kids were going to meet their greatest potential. It became too heavy for us. And what we realized in that work is not only had we identified those who really had needs across all three categories, we really weren't doing anything to help those who maybe were just in one of those areas. We were so overwhelmed with the amount of support needed as we were looking at that data that it was clear we needed more assistance. And that's really where we started thinking about how do we leverage tier one, and how do we get all of our teachers to start to think about themselves as interventionists in the moment in the classroom,
Mm.
building up some skill sets there, but also looking at what outside supports do we need? What kind of community partnerships can we start to grow and establish? It was a driving force as to what expanded our staffing for social workers to be able to provide some additional social work support as we started to see the level of need that we had. And then we also were a district that engaged with, in Michigan, it's called the My Excel Blueprint. It's gone through some new iterations, but it really started to talk about the idea of a safety net. And that safety net is taking your academic and non-academic components to a student and essentially thinking about how do you support a student who's demonstrating some need. And the net is really what the intervention is. And so academically, it might be they need to have some high dosage tutoring for a couple weeks to try to improve on a skill set. But then non-academically, it might be they need to have a check-in, check-out for a couple weeks because they're really struggling organizationally, or they need some mentorship, and we could see some improvements that way across the board. And so together, they work simultaneously because the data is reflected as we're trying to problem solve around a student. It can be either. You're a little bit chicken and egg sometimes as you're assigning interventions, but when you look at it holistically, you kind of land a little bit better on really what is the root cause of the struggle.
Got it. Got it. So, Sephram, diverting it to you, in this complex web of um, correlating factors and challenges that you are trying to problem solve and building capacity, your role was birthed in to basically to pull this all together. Could you just talk through, as you kind of stepped into this role, define what your role was and how has it evolved? And what were some of the milestones you established to ensure that you guys are on a successful path?
Yeah. So my role was to be a support for the district to really ensure that our MTSS systems, our safety net for kids, was really functioning well, that we were monitoring what we were doing and ensuring continuous improvement of those systems across the district. So every level, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 of all of those components, whether it be the academic piece, I support the curriculum, instructional practices with the teachers, our behavior, PBIS, monitoring and supporting those systems and those teams, our social emotional systems, mental health, all of those interventions that we have, really ensuring that those components are well in place, and that our teams are working in a way that is most effective and efficient so that we can intervene early with our students. As far as milestones, I was really fortunate to come into the district when they had already established such great systems, and it was just a matter of helping those to really come together and improve. Teams were in place already and working, and so it was just a matter of looking at what were our processes as a team and how can we improve so that we can be more efficient. What data do we have in front of us? Well, there's lots of data. How do we better look at that data to ensure that we're intervening as early as possible with students? So having those systems in place when I came in, but then really helping to amp that up and ensure that we're moving forward and serving students the best that we can as early as possible.
Got it. Can you double click on elaborating what teams were in place and how did you evolve those teams, and which processes did you have to prioritize to focus on within those teams?
Yeah, so we have lots of teams. We're a small district, and so we have we utilize our resources the best we can. And so, for example, we have our PBIS teams. We have tier 1 teams that are looking at our tier 1 PBIS practices, how we're supporting all students with their behaviors. And then we have tier 2 and tier 3 teams. So as student needs arise behaviorally, those teams are looking at data and identifying which students need interventions to support their behavioral skill deficits. We also had an interconnected school framework team. It was called something different before recently, but that team is really taking all of our groups, our various team leaders and our community partners that come together to kind of work together and ensure that our practices established an attendance team after I had been here for about a year or so, and that attendance team meets every other week, and we're looking at attendance data and ensuring that we're trying to intervene as early as possible and identify interventions that are effective for students that are missing school or becoming chronically absent. So those are a few of the teams that we have.
Got it. Got it. Now, you alluded to community partners, and I understand you are in a rural community, and very typical of rural communities in America. Community partners typically play a crucial role in most schools. Who are some of your key partners in fulfilling the needs of your students, and what mechanisms do you have in place to rally and orchestrate this work with them and through them?
Yeah, I think our community partnerships really started to grow with what's called Health West, which is our community mental health agency in the county. They had applied for a grant called Systems of Care, and we were one of the districts that were awarded, which provided not only a school-based clinician, mental health clinician, that worked right in the district with our students directly here on site. We were also provided a parent support partner who worked directly with families that were identified who were struggling. And so there was an immediate family connection holistically to the family as well to establish those relationships. And then there was a wraparound coordination where if the needs were particularly significant, the entire community mental health system could wrap around the family's needs so that you were at the best possible outcome for a student who's struggling with mental health. It's hard to break a cycle of being stuck in a mental health crisis if you're continuing to be in an environment that sort of allowing for that crisis to continue to unfold. And so with that level of support, we really started to have deeper conversations about how we coordinate together, how we identify student needs, how do we hand off when those interventions are less needed and less severe, how do we get those back to the school-based staff. And then through that relationship and partnership, even further learning came along with interconnected systems framework. We started looking at how does mental health interventions intersect with PBIS in the way that we approach student behavior, and how do we build up skills about behavioral expectations and how to provide predictability through emotional regulation, teaching these concepts around how you handle strong emotions, and in the same way we teach how you walk in the hallway. And so we started to have these deeper conversations, and then these relationships started to lead into additional community partnerships with Heckler Community Care, which is a county-based health organization that provides federally qualified school health centers. And so we were able to establish initially one site that provided a mental health clinician, and then that expanded to 2 sites to provide 2 mental health clinicians across the district. And then that expanded into a school wellness program where we now have school nursing provided here on site. And so sort of a cascading of events where we established a community partnership that kind of started to grow and flourish, and then additional seeds came, and we were able to ramp it up. So now we're in this position where we have, 3 mental health clinicians, school nurse, 2 social workers, an additional elementary counselor we've been able to add, and parent support partner, where we are all working together to try to coordinate support for our kids in a way that keeps that safety net nice and tight, but we're also leveraging the resources that we have in the best way we can, ensuring nobody's carrying too much of the workload, while also still supporting the needs that we have.
And I'll add, those community partnerships and the fact that they're integrated here in our school has been a game changer for us, because, being a rural school, some of those services are not located near where our families live. And so our students are able to receive those services right here in school where they are most hours, where they are, the majority of their day anyways. And so that barrier of families having to take students or their children to a clinician that is not even located in our town nearby, it's right down the hall from their teacher. So those students are able to receive those services while they're here at school. And that just has been a total game changer.
That's wonderful to hear. Now, we started with the ABCs, academic, behavior, and curriculum. No, what was the C, Adam?
Attendance, behavior, course grades.
Yeah, okay. And we dovetailed into safety net, and we talked about the journey. We talked about the teams and the processes. Overall, from when you began to now, how long or how many years has it taken for you to get to this state of maturity?
It's a challenging question. I will say that the journey started pre-pandemic, and I think it's important to recognize that the pandemic, we were still able to leverage our community support partners, but it did shift the work a little bit, especially when we had students who were learning remotely, trying to identify, so there was just a lot of generic, very supportive mental health information that was shared with our community partners, because it was difficult to engage in the same way that we would when we were able to be with our students, in their presence. And so I do think that caused a little bit of a delay in the way that we do and approach the work now, just because the data was just very different for those couple years that we were learning in such a unique way.
And without the pandemic, the research shows that it takes about 3 to 5 years to implement these types of systems to fidelity, if you're dedicated to do that. And I would say that to fidelity, it probably would have taken 3 to 5 years, but continuous improvement is a forever process. So that's where we're at, is we're trying to continuously improve what we're doing. We have great systems in place, and I would say that, for the most part, we're able to implement with fidelity, but it's always about what can we do better for our students and ensure their success.
Got it. So could you expound on that notion of fidelity? and how do you measure it within your practices today?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's the difference between measuring the fidelity of the practice and the intervention. Is the intervention being implemented as prescribed? Is the student receiving the intervention in the amount and the frequency and the intensity that they need it? And measuring that, monitoring that. And that might be as simple as, just keeping track. Is that student receiving that intervention consistently? And then there's fidelity of our implementation of our practices. And so do we have the things in place such as our teams, our database decision making, how we're operating, and are we doing what we are intended to do the way that it's intended to be done. And so again, that's monitoring through assessments like the tiered fidelity inventory. We have another assessment that helps us monitor like our work with our community partners called the Interconnected Systems Framework Implementation Inventory. And so there's research out there that shows what those best practices are, and are we doing the things that if we are doing it with fidelity, we will see the outcomes that we want to have.
Yep, I've run into, and I think we've reviewed those publications even coming out of PBIS. They put out annual checklists, more of a systems check. It's a self-assessment, more of the ecosystem readiness. So I understand that. So could you further speak to how you've evolved in terms of what you measure, what tools that you use, and the approaches that you have adopted? Because one is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We'll get to the distinctions between the tier 2 and tier 3, but my interest in this question is being proactive in addressing the needs of emerging risks in kids. So what are some of the tools that you've had success in using in service to that, which is proactively identifying emerging risks, and how has those tools and approaches evolved over a period of time?
So as I mentioned, we have lots of data on our students. We have our academic data, course grades, and assessment data. We have behavioral data. We have attendance data. We have all of those things. And, previously we had all of this data in various places. And we, like Adam mentioned, we would have cumbersome spreadsheets where the team would try to come together and look at what problems there are, what risk factors students have, and then how we are going to intervene on that. And so that has evolved over time, and how we have combined our data, particularly using cascades, has been very effective for us in putting all of that data in one place. And so it minimizes the time that the team needs to take to really look at what's going on with the student, because it is just showing us all in one spot, in one glance, what are the things that are happening for the student, and therefore what intervention is going to best meet the student's needs. So being able to kind of go through that journey of, having all of this data, first not even knowing what to do with it, then having the processes and systems in place for being able to utilize the data and put interventions in place for students, then getting to the place where we have it all together and makes it more efficient for us, so that we can, again, the key is about intervening early for our students, and the more efficient we as the adults can be, can provide those supports for our students much faster and effectively.
And I think to add to that, some of that transition for us in our journey was, we were using very reactionary data, outward facing, a kid not at school, that's a very clear indication of an issue. The kids acting out in the classroom, clear indication that there's an issue. Kids flunking in the class, clear indication there's an issue. But when we, and this is part of the interconnected system framework work, when we think about PBIS, one of the first things you need to do is you've got to embed a universal screener. And that universal screener, where all kids take this assessment, and that gives a lot more data, where you could see some of that emerging information where an internalizing student is starting to disengage through that universal screener. And that gave a much deeper perspective and the opportunity to intervene on a student more quickly than waiting for them to not show up to school, disrupt the classroom, or flunk their classes. They themselves could be indicating, I'm struggling, and then we're wrapping supports around them right now because they're saying, I'm struggling. And that has been incredibly helpful. And, I think this is the hard truth of the matter. This is it's an epidemic. I mean, we have kids that are struggling. There's not just 10% of our students that struggle, right? We're talking massive amounts of students are feeling the stress of the world, and so then when you think about we have finite resources to provide the support, it's just this is a tough problem, and so we really do need to be thoughtful, and it really is all hands on deck to get the best possible outcomes we can for our students.
Got it. Got it. And could you also, on that note, elaborate a bit on how you have evolved? Is like you started on the universal screening with the externalizing and internalizing behavior concerns, more of a self-assessment and a teacher assessment. And now you've evolved to a place where you have insights into several other dimensions like, peer relationship problems or bullying behavior, emotional dysregulation, and a few others. Where do you see your own practices and priorities evolve now that you have a much more elaborate insight into that?
I think it gives us a better diagnostic about the student and what's going on. So previously, when we would do the screener, like you said, we were only looking at externalizing and internalizing behaviors, and it was based on the teacher's perception. Now what we're able to do is we do have the teacher providing their perception, what they are observing with the student on all of those dimensions that include academic and attention issues, peer relations, bullying, school disengagement, and those externalizing and internalizing behaviors. But we also, as Adam mentioned, we have the students that are able to self provide that information about how they are feeling, what they are experiencing. And so we do have a team that when those screeners are completed, they, as soon as possible, are looking at that data. They're looking at which groups of students are experiencing the same issues. How might we put them in a small group? Are there specific students that have very high levels of needs and they need, some one-on-one time with our social workers, or might we refer them to one of our community partners? And so we're able to just have a greater picture of what's happening with our students because of the use of that screener and our teaming process with the data that we have.
And what's beautiful, I think, about that tool is where we're at in how we're able to kind of shift, because the data is so much richer, is we're part of a system. And so we're able to see what are some of the common themes that are coming through that data. So not only are we connecting students with interventions because it's the here and now, they need that help, but then we're able to step back and say, wow, we have a lot of students who are struggling with this particular issue. And we're leveraging our PBS teams, our SEL curriculum and focus to be able to connect kids, all kids, with that support, because the data indicates that it's a much bigger issue than just the one. Of course, we want to wrap supports around one, but we also need to look at that data in aggregate. And that has been, we have members of the team right now that want to see data represented differently so that they can think about it and grapple with it so that they're making bigger improvements to the building as a whole.
Yeah.
Got it. Got it. So the question I'm asking, I'm not expecting a silver bullet answer, because I know it's subjective, and then you make subjective determination based on objective data. So we talked about Cascades and the other universal screening tools that you have evolved into. When you have that point of view of a student's universal screener and the risk profile on 7 different dimensions, and then you have their behavior data, and then you have the risk profile in that in terms of number of incidences that have happened, and then you have the academic profile. When you see those side by side at an individual student level, it in a way might pop the correlations or validations, right? In one way, when I see a kid expressing high externalizing behavior, and you see corresponding 5 office discipline referrals or suspensions, you just nod your head to say, okay, it kind of adds up. But when you deal with thousands, hundreds and thousands of students, when you have finite resources on how you can render service, how do you take that, even though now it's well organized data, and within each domain it has well represented risk profile, um, how do you take that and then say, hey, here are the 50 kids that really need here and now intervention that we need to prioritize versus uh, prioritize the next set later? Is there what's that approach, and how do you execute on that complex, even though it's well assembled represented data?
Good question.
It is.
The only thing I can speak to is how our team operates when they're looking at that data. Like I said, we have a multidisciplinary team. So when those teams are meeting, it includes the school social worker, the dean of students, the principal, our community partners, oftentimes our truancy liaison. There's a variety of people that know what resources, know what interventions we have. They know the students, they know kind of some of the needs. And when they're looking at the data, they're able to say, okay, I can see that John is experiencing difficulty in these areas. We think that he should receive this intervention. And then we're able to hand that off immediately to the appropriate person that can provide that intervention. And same thing. So the next student that comes up, they're able to say, okay, we're looking at this data, it is going to be best served to put him in this intervention. And so it's just really having that team that comes together. They're looking at the data, they're understanding the issues that the student is experiencing, trying to figure out what's the motivation or the deficit that's coming behind that, and then implementing and putting in place the right intervention to meet those needs. I think
that's great.
I would add, I think your question made me think of, part of the work and part of the, like I said, this is a gigantic issue when we're starting to talk about whole child and looking at all of the needs of our students. You have to put data rules in place because, you have finite resources. And so there has to be some level of what is your tier 3 students? Who are they? And what is that data rule? Where's tier 2 and what's that rule? And what ends up happening is if your needs are really, really high, you have to rely on tier 1 to help provide those supports. And you have to stick to those data rules. Once things stabilize, you can shift your data rules so that because your capacity shifts. And so that's I think a really important dynamic, because your tier 3s may be, you only can do 5%. Like that's what it is. And so those are going to be your neediest of needs, that you're focusing on. If your tier 3 gets too big, it's too much. It's too challenging.
Yeah. That's phenomenal. Multiple things that you both said. I'll pick up from where you left, Adam. Is the data role? It's multidimensional because we do have the data role around academics for early warning. We have data roles on behavior. We have data roles around attendance, right? And then we have psychometrically validated Z-score driven data role around universal screening risk. Now we are talking about how do you then correlate across those 4 dimensions and then really identify who really stacks up in priority. And that's a complex challenge. So that's I'll just leave it at that. Now, to your point, Sephram, you talked about the multidisciplinary team process, I think, which is a powerful thing, combined with what you refer to, Adam, as the whole child. So with the tool that you currently have, you have a multidisciplinary team which is able to look at the whole child data of all the dimensions that we talk about and then make a qualitative, subjective decision prioritizing which kid needs what level of intervention, right? This is great. I think the one last question I have is, do you make a specific distinction on how you determine a child needing a tier 2 intervention versus a tier 3 intervention?
that goes back to those data decision rules. So it would be
Okay.
based on, for each of those areas of academics, behavior, internalizing, externalizing, screening data, whatever that might be, having those data decisions, saying the student has this level of need, the data is showing this, therefore they would be best served in a tier 2 intervention. Or if their needs are much more intense, then they might need something that's more tier 3, more frequent. And then again, it's monitoring that. So as a student is receiving a tier 3 intervention, if you're monitoring and you see improvement, then it might be time to fade that out and maybe move them to a tier 2 intervention that's less intense, less frequent.
That's great. So with that, for your peers and colleagues who are in your seat that may be watching this recorded session, are there any closing thoughts, or are there any questions that I should have asked that might be pertinent to answer from your perspective?
I would say, having solid systems in place does not happen overnight. But really being committed to that and consistent in the work, ensuring that what you are doing is done with that word fidelity, using those tools to measure, are we doing what we are intending to do to get the outcomes that we want. It takes time, and being dedicated to that, you will see the outcomes that you want to see, and it's all about the students. So it's all in those student outcomes.
Yeah, and I would say, it's hard to predict the impact of the work because you never know what, early intervention or a particular way that a question was asked on a screener that saved a life, right? And so there is no silver bullet to this work, certainly, but I think it's very difficult to have the impact of the work fully measured because you might be preventing a horrific outcome that no one wants to face. And so it is the right work, and whatever steps and process that our colleagues take in doing the work, it's good work and it's saving kids. And I know that's what all of us want to do. And those are sometimes the stories that will never be told because they never came to be.
I think that's you put a bow on that. You really put a bow on that. So with that, really thank you both, Adam and Sephram, for investing your time, sharing your experience and your perspective for the benefit of others who are coming right alongside or coming right behind you.